We are so glad you joined us today to get centered, but we have a disclaimer. Being centered really is more of an aspiration than a destination. This is a vodcast where we'll be discussing all things mind and body, mental health, physical well-being, parenting, marriage, healthy touch, anger and how to handle it. What is integrative medicine? How do I meditate? What are we learning from COVID in this quarantine experience? Where do we go from here? You have questions on these topics, and we ask those same questions ourselves. So this isn't a vodcast full of answers. It's one full of discussion, because we're going to tell you right now we do not have all the answers, but we do love a rich discussion and hope you do too. We're Leila Scott and John Price, the founders of the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, and this vodcast is hosted by our amazing team, which is comprised of an integrative group of therapists offering individual, couples, family, depth therapy, and offers support groups for men, women, teens, young professionals, and others. Chinese medicine practitioners offering acupuncture, herbal medicine, food therapy, lifestyle advice, and last but not least, our mindfulness meditation and spirituality guide. Be sure to reach out to us to let us know other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or to let us know if you'd like to work with our integrative team. We are here for you and offering virtual care as well as home delivery of wellness self-care packages during this time of physical separation. Give us a shout at 713-526-4444 and be sure to follow us on social at Center for HAS. And now, please enjoy the show.
Well, hey folks, welcome back to Get Centered. Here we are, the practitioners at the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. And if you've been watching this series, what you've known is that the past 3 episodes, we've been talking about race, policy, identity, sexuality. And today what we want to do is talk about, really integrate. We want to bring things together, have a discussion amongst the clinicians, and talk about how we're affected by the interviews that we've had and certainly what's going on in the world. It's good to see you all here today. And thanks for joining us if you're watching. So I think a springboard certainly is identity. Today's episode, and I want to get this right, where is it? Getting Unstuck, breaking down the various versions of you. I think a lot of the discussions that I've been having as of late is, if people are willing, have the eyes to see and the willingness to introspect, they are recognizing all the various different voices that we have inside of ourselves. And my favorite image for this is King Arthur's court, where we have a round table and all the different personalities that come to communicate. They fight, they argue, they fall in love, they hate, they have different perspectives and beliefs. And I think one of the difficult things that the current understanding of our identity is that it's singular. It's a monotheistic vision. And what I certainly try to help people understand is that we are a multiplicity. We have many different selves inside of us. And at any given moment, I'm kind of a different self is constellating. And the I that is me is the integrating whole, where I experience all those different selves. So let's launch out and chat about, first, I think, how we've been affected by the conversations that we've had, what questions, thoughts, curiosities you have, and what you're seeing in your practices as a result of what's going on in the world with the transformation that we're having, and the injustices that have been perpetrated by the systems that we have in place, and the need for us to change those systems. So where do y'all want to start today?
I think it could be interesting to start with cognitive dissonance, and this idea that, just like you were saying, we're pluralistic, multiplicity selves. And so we tend to pick an identity. And then if somebody suggests to us that we're anything but that identity, or if somebody else lives out an existence that is in conflict with our identity, then we have problems. But to do the self-exploration, to realize that we are pluralistic beings, allows us to create an understanding for ourselves and others. I mean, these conversations have led us down a complete rabbit hole of documentaries and podcasts and articles, and instead of just listening to the news, doing research. And when we read an article, we click on the hyperlink for that article writer, that journalist, that the resource that journalist used, and then we're able to come up with our own answers because of all of that work we're doing. And I think that's another thing we learned, is that that understanding who we are as white people, or even straight people, or people who identify within one religion or another, is that we have a responsibility to do the research into our own histories and into other people's histories. It's work.
Yeah. Who's up next?
It's interesting that you mentioned King Arthur, because I think we also have very modern references to that too. We've got Star Trek, and we've got Kirk and Spock, you've got the Avengers. I think to Leela Scott's point, I think we are often attracted to these culturally because they resonate something within us. Part of us relates to all these different characters in an external way or in a projecting way. But when it comes down to living ourselves, that's where the cognitive dissonance kicks in, and we really hold on tight to being one or the other. And the getting unstuck part necessitates being uncomfortable with those different parts.
Before we continue, though, I want to do some tending to this term, cognitive dissonance. And certainly for people watching, we want to be really careful and mindful not to just throw these terms out there and not help us understand them, certainly, but also define them for the way in which we're using them. I want to throw something out, Leela Scott, and then anybody please fix this or add to it or whatever. Cognitive dissonance is when there are two opposing views. And what we do to reconcile the split is we essentially choose one of them. So if I'm feeling in conflict and I'm unable to endure the ambiguity or the paradox, what I tend to do, or what we tend to do, is choose the one over the other. And then we hold to that, which is what you see when people really justify their actions, because they're not understanding nuance and they're holding rigidly to the one-sidedness of an issue to not feel like they're in conflict. The internal conflict feels uncomfortable, so we don't like that. Again, with this singularity, with a single perspective, we like that because it's simple, it's elegant, it's to the point, it's reductionistic, but it is definitely not paradoxical, and it does not have any ambiguity. So we tend to thirst for certainty, or there's a certain typology inside of us that thirsts for certainty. And when we are unable to recognize that we are this multiplicity, we fall into those habits of certainty. Anybody else want to add?
I have a question. I guess I have a question about that because I'm like a little bit on the outside in terms of the terminology. So I guess I get to ask the questions because break it down for me like playground level. Like what's happening? How does that kind of thing happen on the playground?
I have one thing to add. I suppose, if we're going to use playground terminology, you can think of it like an ego identification issue. So if I consider myself that I'm not a bully, and then somebody accuses me of being a bully, and maybe my behavior was bullyish, right? And that's why I was being called a bully. I take issue with that. I am not a bully. Don't you dare call me that. So I can't hear that the way I behaved moments ago was bullyish. I can't go there. I'm just completely shut down.
Right. So then what happens what happens if I'm kind of keep being confronted with, I don't want to be a bully, but now people are telling me I'm acting like a bully. So I don't want to be a bully, but I'm acting like one. So now what happens? What causes the dissonance? What's that? Is the fact that I'm acting that way, but I don't want to be that way. And then what's the kind of how do I push that down? What's the mechanism to create that kind of rift? I'm kind of trying to understand for myself.
Yeah. I mean, John, I want you guys to chime in too, but just my initial response to that would be that the dissonance itself is the ego, right? The ego does not want to die. It defines who we are, and it feels like our end all be all. Of course it's not. So if somebody tries to poke a hole in what we consider to be who we are, we're going to defend that, to the death practically. So what happens next is a choice, it seems like. And it seems some people are more able to go to that place inside themselves where they can say, hey, well, maybe I was acting bullyish, and gosh, well, let me consider, other people know it's just, they can't go there. What would y'all say about it?
Yeah, jumping off of that, I would say the dissonance is almost that discomfort. It's like the unwillingness to accept a different reality from what you saw. And as therapists, right, the next step is being introspective. But I think that that dissonance part is really just sitting in the, whoa, like that's not true. It's like that defense mechanism of, wait a second, like that's not what I was doing. It's not who I am. And it's almost like that unwillingness to step in and say, okay, maybe this person is misperceiving me, or maybe I am being incorrect or doing something wrong.
Rodney, I'm curious what you would say about dissonance from a music theory perspective.
From a music theory perspective, is more of a yin yang thing, that dissonance is necessary, but only in relationship to consonance. So that the dissonance must be relieved. But if we're only in this static, relieved state, that there is no development. And I would say, as a human being, always being in the ego is right comfort zone is the same as no growth. And so the pattern of dissonance consonance in music, and the pattern of I'm uncomfortable, I'm comfortable. We need enough security to be comfortable in who we are to a certain extent. But as you know, in attachment theory, with really, really young kids, the more secure they are with their caregiver, the more willing they are to go out and explore new things. And I think that's completely the same as adults, that we need this ongoing relationship between being uncomfortable, being challenged, and having security and knowing who we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of atrocities that have been committed under the banner of love. And we only need to look at our religions to say there are some horrible things that happen under the banner of love. I am a loving, accepting, I invite you in, and if you don't believe what I believe, I'll kick you out or I'll hate you. And what happens is for me, that's a really primal example of dissonance, because I've got to reconcile, do I really want to live of love, or do I just want to push that person out so I don't have to confront how I'm not living of love? And then that's the discomfort where I figure out, no, I am of love. And what that makes me do or asks me to do is consider where I'm not. And as I like the image of expanding, because, and not becoming one-sided or rigid. So if I can expand to begin to include others and to begin to include my discomfort and these kinds of scenarios in my awareness, I evolve, and then I can more readily move in fluidity as opposed to certainty and rigidity, which, even the thing I think that's so important is not to say, I'm not rigid. It's to say, where am I rigid? It's not to say, I'm not dissonant. Or it's how am I dissonant and where am I dissonant? And that's what's so important about our search for awareness, is it's beginning to include those things that we've kind of kicked out of our own territory and invite it in and say, okay, that thing that has been living in the wilderness needs to be included, needs to be reconnected and remembered. I mean, again, I get religious with all this stuff, but the definition of religion, one interpretation is to reconnect. To reconnect with what? Well, to reconnect with that which has been forgotten, which has been disowned, which has been never included in my understanding of who I am. And through my relationship to other people, I begin to be a more whole and expansive person. But if I just choose the path of one-sidedness, which is the way Jung defined neurosis, then I can be kind of safe in my own territory, but I've sent all my demons out into the world and projected them onto other people, and they get to carry it for me. And that is atrocious, I think, and creates a lot of disharmony. But my ability to say, I want to look that demon in the face and begin to figure out where it lives in my life, that's the path of consciousness. And I think that's what we've been talking about for the past 3-4 weeks, but certainly well before that, but in this conversation of race and social injustice.
Yeah. Well, and to take it one step further, it's like we've sent our demons out and placed them onto other people. But then when those people remind us that we are, to use the analogy, demonic ourselves, it's like, how dare you remind me that I am not perfect?
Right.
very challenge my idea of myself, you know.
Kind of interesting though, like a couple thoughts popped into my head how like even in session, all my kids have been doing, we've been doing so much research into all these issues compared to like conversations I've had with like grown ass adults. It's just like, you know, with adults, you're like stuck with, okay, I don't want to do anything with this because I feel uncomfortable and, you know, I still have my set of beliefs versus kids nowadays where they're like, okay, I'll actually think about it. I want to research on it. I want to get to know more. What's making me feel like I don't want to be the enemy towards, you know, Blacks, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Caucasian, like all those kinds of conversations have popped up. So it's just kind of interesting to see that they want to like kind of explore their own identities and who they want to kind of, you know, see as like a model in the community. So yeah, and then with adults, it's just kind of like, nope, not going to talk about it today because it's not my thing. But then there's the question, it's like, when is the right time to have it be your thing? You know, when is the time to be able to talk about it and just even explore? So
I think for me,
Sorry,
it's like I remember for me it was the tipping point. Like it was a point where it was boiling over. That was what forced the action. It wasn't like I was just like a willing. I mean, I think different. It's different, a little different now. But I'm thinking back to, you know, I had this self concept of like I'm this loving, you know, good, nice, religious guy, and then all of a sudden I'm catching myself, you know, looking around me in school and judging people and like, you know, making all kinds of stories about how they're slacking off and they're not respecting the time. And yeah, I don't know, you know, like there's a whole story in there about like we've all been in school, we know what it's like for people to show up late. Maybe we were the one who was showing up late or just not taking it seriously. And I remember like it was so hard for me to have that as part of me because that judgmental like energy that was coming up was so in dissonance with who I wanted to be and who I thought I needed to be. And so it was like the the fact that I was rejecting it was actually making it even worse. Like it was I didn't want this judgmental part of me to be there, and then just sort of like denying that it was there was actually causing it to be even deeper. And so like through the work of like you said, John, like right, like let's bring it in, right? Let's how about we bring it in. And I was like, okay, well, look, you know what? Judgmental is part of me. You know what? It's not, it's like it's there. So why don't I see how it's working at least instead of trying to push it away? Because pushing it away is definitely not working, right? And it was because it wasn't working so much that I had to do something different. It was not like out of a comfort. It wasn't like I didn't see judgmental and go, oh yeah, come on in. It was like judgmental was taking over. That was the point where I was like, I can't live like this. You know, I don't want to be like that. That's not who I want to be. I don't know if that's kind of like what we're talking about here, but now it's no, you know, it's not comfortable for me to even say that. It's like to say that here is like to say, okay, I'm judgmental. Like, what kind of an a-hole?
Ariel, I think but that really gets at what we're saying. And I was just thinking about, I'm kind of writing things down as we're going, and I'm thinking about what you said about kind of playground rules here, like really putting it into terms on the playground. And I think simply put is I have a desire to be accepted. I have a desire to belong. If I speak up about something that I disagree with, I may not be accepted. That's cognitive dissonance. So then I have to reconcile this. And what we so often do is we just shut up. We don't say a thing. We play along. We get along to go along, right? That's fine. But that builds like the financial bubble, right? I mean, it builds a repository of this. You're hindering your self-expression. You're not really coming to know yourself because you're making sacrifices in these little tiny ways. And that the energy has to go somewhere. So it oftentimes can turn into all kinds of personal issues that manifest throughout life. But they're very, very small and nuanced. They don't have to be these major issues. Of course, it's fine to talk in those terms, but laughing at a joke, you're sitting around with friends. There's a joke that you don't like. Do you laugh? Do you not? Do you say something or not? There are times when I've not said anything.
I think what Ariel is saying is important because it's on that true micro internal level. And if we're in a place where we can't even notice, oh man, there's a part of me that's judgmental. I'm not sure how I feel about that. How do I now relate with this part of myself that I'm now conscious of? Then how are we going to do it on a larger scale with the rest of the world? And Ariel, as you were talking, I was thinking something that I've just come up with for myself over the years is like, whether we're divine with a spark of human or human with a spark of the divine, we obviously seem to be both, right? So we're going to have these unsavory human characteristics, right? Whether it's judgmentalism or something else. And one thing that I'll do with myself if I have one of those feelings or thoughts is I'll just go, oh, hey, human. Hey, just noticing, oh, that's the human part of me. Of course, I'm going to have a thought like that, instead of feeling shame about it, you know?
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious what, like, physically, how these kinds of things physically manifest. Because to hear from you, Lila Scott, because I know that in my own experience, I do feel those kinds of dissonances in my body, right? It's
Mhm.
not just mental. They end up getting kind of like, I don't know what the terms are, but it feels like it's trapped in there
Yeah.
because I'm not dealing with it. And then my back hurts, and then my this hurts, and then my that hurts, and then it's like, I'm curious from your perspective how that manifests.
Yeah. I mean, just on a very, very basic level, that's what we call chi stagnation, energy that isn't moving. And I can't remember if we said it on this podcast before, but energy um, cannot be, the energy expression in our bodies can't be differentiated, right? So like the scientific, as we know it, like the biophysiological function of the liver, say, cannot be removed from its emotional function, or the kidney or the heart, and so on. And so when you have an emotion that is stuck, and whichever organ it pertains to is stuck, you're going to start having the biophysiological stuckness as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then the therapeutic process that you guide people through helps to counterbalance that, or how does that work?
Absolutely. I mean, the acupuncture itself is helping the energy to move, helping the body. Rodney, you referenced yin and yang before. That's when energy is all one thing, and then we have the two things to polarize, right? The yin and the yang, on, off, cold, hot, awake, asleep, quiet, loud. And so the very basic and boiled down version of that is we're trying to balance those two dualistic aspects of ourselves in every way with the pins.
I love that. I love that. I mean, I think that sounds like the body version of what, Rodney and John and Nat and Gia are trying to do on a cognitive level, right? It's like, how do I allow space in my mental life so that I can kind of whatever the counterbalance, right? Whatever the heat or the cold, right? John talks about this like it's a cooking. I remember he says this all the time. It's like the right amount of heat, right? We got to get the right amount of heat on so that it actually creates a transformation.
Mhm.
And not too much that it burns, and not so little that it's not cooking, right? And that seems to be like part of the work here is like, how do you get that in place?
To me, that's been the silver lining, or like the beautiful aspect of this movement, because as therapists, right, we do try to get people to be more conscientious of their stories, their narratives, how they're speaking, what they're doing, their impact on their relationships, on society. I mean, we always talk about how one decision, one action always has a rippling effect that we don't always realize. And I think, at least from the conversations I've had, not just with clients, but with friends, with family, is that now there is at least even that awareness that has never existed before. I mean, John, even what you said before with like, well, do I laugh at a joke?
Mhm.
let's say like 5 months ago, no one would have even thought about that. Like, oh, okay, whatever, it's not a big deal. Like, I'm just uncomfortable. I'm avoiding an awkward situation. But now we're like, wait a second, like,
Mhm.
silence can be dangerous. Why aren't I speaking up about it? How is this even happening? How have I not noticed? And I think that's, again, for me as a therapist, that beautiful revolution of us as a society and a culture is that now more and more people are being aware of that, or even just taking the step to even think about it, because I think sometimes like that first step isn't always there, because I think as therapists, at least I know myself, I'm always rushing to be like, okay, like let's think about it, let's talk about it. I do it in relationships all the time, where I talk about how two couples, like, they don't always realize how they're affecting each other because they're so stuck in their ways. And now again, as a whole culture, we're starting to realize the impacts of what we're doing to other people, even if they're not being around, right? Like, even if it doesn't necessarily feel personal, you're starting to realize, wait a second, that little comment, that little thing that I ignored or pushed off affects so many more people than I ever realized.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like our guest Shavana said, simple isn't always easy, and to interrupt the process of that silence. You might be having to interrupt it with your partner or your family member or your best friend, and relationships, not all of them might sustain, right, us speaking up. And that's a terrifying notion. But at some point we have to take that risk, it seems. And to go back to the cognitive dissonance piece, when it comes to the difficult conversations, as careful as we can be to, John and I were talking about this last night, to not say, oh, you did X, Y, or Z, so you are a racist or you are anti-gay. Instead saying, hey, you may not have realized, I know your heart, you're a good person, but what you just said, that was not something that's going to help what's going on in our world regarding race or sexuality or fill in the blank, so that person is less likely to go into that defensive place of cognitive dissonance and can hear, oh, they're not calling me a terrible person. They're saying that I could maybe pay a little more attention to the thing I just said and,
I
retool it.
I think that's what got me unstuck from my own kind of like judgmental situation too. It was like, instead of thinking of myself as like, it's all or nothing kind of a thing, I sort of assumed, I came back to that assumption of like, okay, you know what? Just like you said, I'm a human, right? I'm not perfect. Like, there's a lot of parts of me, whether I like it or not, and like I am trying to be good, and I am trying to be nice, and this is a part of me that is coming up, and it's like, that's fine, right? That's okay. It's the same thing that I to do it for myself and to do it for other people. It's the same thing. It's like, I think it has to start at home first. Like, I think it has to start here, but I mean, also, it can start the outside in. I don't know. Either way is fine. It's the same anyway. It's circular, but eventually it has to land at home, right? If you want to get unstuck yourself, at some point you got to turn to yourself and give yourself the decency that you would give other people who you love, right? To say like, I know you don't mean it that way, right? I know you're not trying to be judgmental because I know you got a good heart, and what you just said could sound that way, right? And like, this is what it sounded like to me, and it's not a judgmental thing, right? I'm not putting you in a I'm not saying you're bad. I'm just saying that what you just said, you probably didn't think about it, right? Or And that kind of like loosens it up a little bit. It seems like that's the beginning of getting unstuck, right? It's like having this ability to question of like, okay, so it's not like John, you started it this way exactly. It's like, it's not like if I am it's like, how am I? How am I? And then that changes the conversation. It's like, oh, okay, so it's just naturally part of the process of this humaning thing that we're doing to get stuck. So how am I getting stuck? And then it doesn't have to be a blame game of like, oh, I'm terrible and going into shame about who I am as a fundamental human. It can just be like, okay, that's part of being human, right? It's part of me. It's not all of me, and I can move on from there. I can grow from that instead of feeling like this is like threatening my sense of who I am, kind of a thing.
Isn't that such a relief?
It is. Sorry to jump in, Leila Scott. Do you have something to say there?
Oh, I was just thinking about how one of my sisters used to be a teacher, and what she would do at the beginning of each semester is whatever the bad words were at the time, she would make them kind of yell them out over and over again. And nobody was allowed to get in trouble for it. And there was like one day where they could just kind of spontaneously yell out the bad word, and then it was over. That tension was removed. And there's some sort of relief to the thought that we could all just admit how imperfect we are. And of course, as much as I don't like the idea that I might have racist behaviors, what a relief to just go, okay, I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes, but I really do want to commit to being conscious and to continue to learn and help this awareness expand in whatever way that I can.
I want to kind of add something to stir to the pot here, because the developmental component keeps coming up for me as we're talking about this, regarding identity and cognitive dissonance. Because in fact, a lot of developmental theorists really looked at those moments of dissonance as moments where, when we resolve the dissonance, we can kind of, this is too linear, but we kind of transcend the mode of our developmental stage that came before us. So there, what Erik Erikson did a really good job of looking at this, and it's a good model. It's not as if it's absolute fact, but what he did is look at, early on, there is a trust versus mistrust dynamic that happens in our lives. Is the world safe or is it not? And the truth is that it's both. And my ability to have a safe, secure, loving person will help me go on adventures, even on a daily basis, where I kind of go beyond the ring of where I should be going, and I explore beyond that. And life is about a series of those kinds of dual dynamics that we reconcile and then transcend. But we don't always do that. A lot of time we say stuck. So early on in life, one of the things that happens is that if you take a father or a caregiver or a mother or whomever is kind of in a role of caregiving for you, what I have to do is notice that there's a humanness in my parent. And I come to this world with a need to be provided care by somebody else. I can't do it on my own. So we come born here ready to be nurtured and nourished by our environment. And so, of course, what we do is idealize that environment. And we'll say things like, my father is perfect, or my mother is the best thing in the world, or they're absolute evil, they're horrible. Well, again, the fact here is that they're a bit of both. And part of what we have to do developmentally is say, my father, I think, is one of the best people in the world, and yet he did something that I don't really like, or that doesn't fit into that. And so now I have to look at this and say, either he's all good, or he's bad, or he's both. And to the degree that I can do that, and so that I can look at other people with those same eyes and not have to pigeonhole them into, you are all bad or all good, you are absolute racist or not, but you can be both. That's the kind of attitude I think that we're trying to cultivate collectively, which is that, can we hold space for this nuance? And can we expand our understanding of who I am and who you are, to include all the parts of ourselves that we know are there? I mean, we know in our own hearts that there are horrible things we think and horrible things we feel. And if we're not able to recognize that, and believe me, I'm a psychotherapist, I work with people who say, you're fucking kidding me, I don't have that in my heart. And we have to work and move towards a space, even when we resist that and say, oh shit, yeah, that is showing up, and I do need to take a look at that. And now what does that mean? And I wanted to go back to something, at the risk of jumping too soon, but it was something you said, Leila Scott, when you were talking about the human being both human and divine. And, so here we are, a bunch of, psychotherapists, acupuncturists, rabbis, and, and beyond, using terminology. And I want to define, when we talk in this space, maybe not other spaces, but in this space on Get Centered, when we say the term divine, what do we mean? Ariel, I want both of y'all to answer, but Ariel, I want you to try to take that one on.
I can only say what I mean, because I don't know. I mean, I don't know what y'all mean, but when I think that like I have to back up and say what I think it used to mean in my life, and I think it's natural for a lot of people to think it means based on the liturgy and based on reading the Bible, which is like it feels like if you read those things and you take that for granted, then what divine means is this like definitely a man, right? It's a gendered, it's a king, it's a man in the sky, kind of like has like is probably perfect and can do no wrong and is like making decisions about how things go on around here, meaning on the earthly plane. And I think that that was like the previous concept, which was really bad for me. It's like not it's and I'm not even a woman, so I can't even imagine what that's like on the other end if you're not that gender, right? That's even I can't even imagine the harmfulness of that view. And so what I actually mean is not really in opposition to that, but it's like the so okay, so even just a test experiment now. You can notice that you can smell, hopefully you can smell, you can taste, you can hear, you can feel, you can see, hopefully. God thank God if you can do all those things, right? And you can think. Now there's also another part of you that can know that those things are happening. And what I think is that that is the divine. Like that's not me. I mean, for me, that part of me, the inside that's noticing, is part of the divine, and you cannot untie it from the divine. And that's in you and you and you and you and everybody listening, right? It's the thing that allows us to be awake, right? The thing that keeps this whole show going, basically. Whatever that energy is that's moving this universe along, that's allowing me to be lit up and you to be alive, because none of us are making ourselves be alive. Or I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but uh, it doesn't seem that way to me. And I feel like that part of me that is able to notice, that's what I'm connecting to when I'm meditating, is like I'm connecting to that divine thing that I can detect from within. And when I'm with that, I make much better decisions, right? It's much less difficult for me to accept the difficulty and the parts of myself that I don't want to like be happy. Like I don't want to be there, right? I don't want judgmental, but when I'm noticing it, I'm like, oh, hey, judgmental is coming up, right? Uh, so yeah, I guess I don't know if that answers the question fully, but that's kind of what I mean.
I
That
like
to
it.
me is like the description of consciousness almost, right? Like the ability to think about thinking. That's what separates us from feral animals. And I think because we have that ability, I think we have that much more responsibility to use it effectively and to the best to kind of continue our higher elevation of elevated beings.
You used a good term there. That I like etymology a lot, so I tend to break these terms down. Consciousness is two words. Con and ciencia is the base term, and it means knowing. Like essentially, science means knowing, and so ciencia with knowing is what consciousness is, and so that really affirms what you were saying, Ariel. You know that with our knowingness, we're able to experience this multiplicity and make space for it all and include it all. And I just think, you know, Leila Scott, when you said divine earlier, you know, and of course this has been a pursuit of mine for many years at this point. I mean, I hear the way that we mean these terms, and I also hear the way that other people hear them. And I've got a dear friend of mine who's a priest, who talks about this all the time. Like somebody says, you know, why do you believe in God? And he goes, well, who is God? You know, and then he says, well, I don't believe in that God either. You know, that's not my definition. So as we move through this and we try to unpack all this, I do think it's important that we understand the terms we use. And it's not a big guy with a beard in the sky we're talking about. It's an inner presence that you can connect with, and we are certainly in, you know, intense moments of connected sex, and when we're, you know, fusing together with another human being, in moments of meditation, in heightened experience, where it's, you know, the birth of a child or these powerful and miraculous moments, there's a certain fluidity and with knowingness where the entire universe is included in our awareness. Not really, but it feels that way. And I think I agree. I mean, that's a divine space. Gio, do you have anything to add? No, I'm gonna point you out every now and then. You know, Rodney, what about you?
I mean, this is definitely to be continued for another conversation, the idea of the divine, because then I'm thinking about your podcast with Jill Bolte Taylor and the idea of, you know, we think of consciousness as human being, rational, left brain, linear, linguistic, and that's a slice of consciousness, but that's not consciousness. And when we experience the other pure experiential aspect of that Ariel was talking about, you know, that's consciousness. The only thing I would add is that, John, when you're talking about the big moments can also happen in a surprising way in the smallest of moments, a particular sunset, a particular look between two people, a particular conversation. You know, those things break in at unexpected times. And so, you know, I think we can't just limit them to the big life-changing things, because and what Ariel does in terms of meditation and guiding people, it's the fact that this is a humming thing going on at all times that we're just generally not connected to. And so how do we stay connected more of the time rather than less of the time, which is not, to me, doing something, but getting out of the way so that we can experience.
So I want to be aware to kind of pull this together, because we don't have a ton of time left. And I want to bring identity into this, because essentially we keep talking about the micro and the macro, and what happens on a micro level, meaning my own development, my own disowned parts, you know, for whatever reason, my own unconscious selves, also happens on the macro level. And what we have that's going on currently is there are people, particular groups of people, that don't feel included in the system that has been created for them to live in. And okay, like that happens in a therapist's office all the time, where we're trying to integrate parts of ourselves that have been disowned or disconnected or cut off in some way. Collectively, if we have the view that we are one people, that we are, that again, that's that kind of mystical view that we are kind of fluidly connected to all people, that we are all brothers and sisters. If we have that view, then what we're saying is there are our brothers and sisters who feel forgotten, who have been forgotten, who have been cut out from a system, and who are being brutalized as a result of it. Now, what do we do as a group of people to begin to integrate our brothers and sisters into the whole, into a system that includes everybody? And how we do that, we can actually use psychotherapy or healing or acupuncture. We can use these theories and philosophies as a model for how we can begin to do that difficult work that is difficult enough when I'm sitting on the proverbial couch and doing my own work. That's hard. As a system where you know, the people that we're all trying to include, we may not know personally. You know, the person, I didn't know George Floyd personally, but I certainly want him included in this system as my brother. And so I think that's one of the hooks we need to hang this conversation on, which is that as we meander through these kinds of conversations, we're talking about what we do in this microscopic or micro world, how it is applied to a larger context. Any thoughts about that?
This makes me think of that age-old saying, right? Like, put yourself in their shoes for a moment. Try to imagine if it were personal. What if it were your child? What if it was your friend, your family member? What if it was happening to you? And just momentarily trying to insert yourself in their shoes, feeling that rage. Now imagine that it's happening over and over again. Wouldn't you want people to fight for you? Wouldn't you want people to be on your side? And I think that's where our responsibility comes in, because even though it might not necessarily directly affect us, or it's not personal, you'd still want somebody to be there for you if it were you.
And to bring it back into the kind of like practice space internally, it's like all of those pieces of me that I don't want, I wish they weren't there, right? Like the thoughts that come up that I'm not proud of, the ways that I think and relate to the world that I kind of wish were like someone else's, you know. And I think it's exactly what you said. What we're all saying the same thing, really. It's like from different perspectives. It's like we are all one thing. That's like when we can see that from within the work, right? When we can see, like, you know what, this crazy thought is not my crazy thought. It's just a crazy thought, right? This crazy aspect of myself is part of just being human. It's not about me, right? And then I don't have to have shame over that, right? I can just like bring it in and say, like, come on in, right? Obviously you're here already, right? And so now let's like make room for you within this system so that you don't have to be oppressed, because when I oppress you and I try to push you into the shadow, then like then everything goes haywire, right? With my whole system, with my chi, with my mental ability to be in the world, with my dissonance, right? Like everything gets sort of messed up that way.
Yeah. And what I would say is, one of the beauties of Chinese medicine is that we look at the root issue in addition to the symptoms, and I think some of what we get fed up with modern medicine is that it's so symptom oriented, and it doesn't seem to be curious why do you have this symptom, instead of just like, let's take a pill and get rid of the symptom. And I think, well, I know, right, we all know that what we're seeing right now are just massive symptoms of structural problems, root problems. And so I think it's important to not be distracted by all the tentacles waving around, and to get into the nitty gritty of the symptom. Let's focus our energies back to the root, which we know started when this country was started. So yeah, I don't know where to go with that, but to me, it's a root issue, and if we can focus our attentions and energies and awarenesses on how to retool the root of this country, I don't know how else to begin.
And yeah, and that's that kind of like the developmental piece that the therapy world is kind of focusing on, the Jungian especially, is from birth, right? From birth, what happened? Like how did we develop into the people we are, and how did we assume that the systems were going to be there to be perfect, right? That the people that we were born to, the systems we were born into, are like ideal, right? And we assume that, and then we get stuck on account of it. We trap ourselves with that narrative too, because then we have to be perfect too. And it's sort of, I think we're all talking about the same thing.
Any other closing thoughts? I have one, which is that our history is not history. Our history lives in the present moment. And for us to understand how we live that out present day is extremely important. And that happens developmentally in the psychotherapist's office, when we kind of take a backward glance to why in the world does this pattern keep happening to me? But it doesn't stop there. It is how do I still live that out in the present day? And how can I continue to grow beyond that narrative and become the person that I was created to be? It is not just that narrative. It's beyond that. And so we have to look at those historic experiences. And I won't tangent because this is a whole entire conversation, but the fucking history books are wrong. They are written by people that had some kind of motivation. You got to go. Bye, Gia.
Me too. Okay.
They are written by people with motivation, with ulterior motive. And so even that history that we need so desperately to learn from, we're not getting the whole bit of history. And it's a little like, somebody coming into psychotherapy and saying, like, my mother always told me that that so-and-so was my father. And to learn one day, like, no, that was all a lie. And in fact, your father lives in, Minneapolis or, New York City, and he wants to meet you. And it's like, holy shit, like I have to reevaluate a lot of the assumptions that I built my life on. And that's what we're currently doing, is reevaluating the assumptions that have been whitewashed, that we live on and that we benefit from, and that we desperately need to change to include all of our fellow people, brothers and sisters, friends. So I think that, Leila Scott and I certainly in our home life are, I think one vodcast conversation that I would like to have is how to do research, because we're working diligently to how to really come to research, because what's handed to us isn't necessarily false, but it's been affected by all kinds of ulterior motives, and we need to find better ways to get to the root of this essence. That's all. Anything else, y'all? Okay. I see you thinking, Leila Scott.
Oh yeah, all kinds of thoughts, but really
For another
think
day.
nice enough for right now, probably.
Okay, you guys. Good chatting with y'all. See you next time.
Bye.